Aegon the Free, Chapter 1, Aegon the Unburnt. Long ago, a man by the name of Rhaegar Targaryen had fallen in love with a young maiden by the name of Lyanna Stark. The maiden had too fallen in love with the man, but she unfortunately had already been betrothed to another by the name of Robert Baratheon. Rhaegar and Lyanna had decided to run away together, starting one of the most brutal wars in all of Westeros, known as Robert's Rebellion. The war would officially end when the Mad King Aerys Targaryen had been stabbed through the heart by his own hand, Jaime Lannister, in order to stop him from setting all of King's Landing ablaze with a substance known as wildfire. During the war, Rhaegar would be murdered by Robert striking him in the chest with his giant hammer, whilst Lyanna would die giving birth to their son, Aegon Targaryen, the sixth of his name, in order to protect their only son from Robert's wrath. Lyanna's dying wish would be for her fallen husband's younger brother, Viserys, to take the child with him when he fled to Essos with his pregnant mother. When Rhaella Targaryen would perish giving birth to Daenerys, Viserys was left to raise two children on his own, whilst being forced to live in hiding in poverty. Viserys would raise young Aegon as if he were his own child. He would tell him stories of their ancestors every night. However, he grew to resent Daenerys for the death of their mother, and would often mistreat her as a result of his resentment towards her. Aegon would grow up to be spoiled, with Viserys often referring to him as the realm's delight, whilst Daenerys would grow up to be meek and timid. In spite of his spoils, Aegon often found himself longing for something more. Something that was always just out of reach. Freedom. All of his life, Aegon, along with his aunt and uncle, would constantly live in fear, forced to move on several occasions in order to avoid Robert's assassins. Aegon never truly knew what home was as a result. He may have been a king, but he never truly felt like one. No king should have to live in fear after all. However, Viserys had a plan. He would trade his younger sister, Daenerys, to a Dothraki Khal to wife in exchange for an army. With an army of savages at his disposal, Viserys planned to take back his nephew's birthright for him. As Viserys discussed the details with his hand, Jorah Mormont, Aegon found himself tuning out their conversation in favor of entertaining himself with his own thoughts. Aegon began to daydream of finally getting to return to his rightful home and sit upon a throne made up of the thousands of blades his ancestors' enemies. He would never have to live in hiding again if he were a feared king like his grandfather. Well, what if I don't want to be his queen? Aegon was then snapped out of his thoughts by his aunt's protests. Well, then what is it you want then, sweet sister? Viserys attempted in vain to hide his irritation behind a mask of sincerity. I just want to go home, was Daenerys' reply, as the poor girl fought back tears. In response, Viserys gently caressed her cheek. I wish to go home too, sweet sister. That is why I am willing to let the Khal, all of his men, and even their horses have their way with you in order to achieve that. Viserys then spat much to Aegon and Jorah's discomfort before roughly grabbing Daenerys' hand in order to lead her over to the front steps of their current abode. When Khal Drogo rode up to the small palace upon his mighty stallion, Aegon perked up with pure interest as he felt a small chill of fear rush down his spine at the Khal's intense glare. As Khal Drogo began to examine the appearance of his new wife, Aegon began to examine the Khal's appearance as if he were witnessing a real dragon being reborn. Muscular, hairy, and covered in tribal tattoos. Aegon would bet his crown that Khal Drogo had never had to live in fear once in his life. After taking a good look at Daenerys, Khal Drogo then rode away without a single word. "Where is he going? Does he like her?" Viserys demanded as he and Aegon watched the Khal leave with utter confusion. "Oh, we would know if he didn't like her." Aegon found himself shuddering once again at Jorah's words, as he found himself wishing that he were Khal Drogo instead of the beggar king that he currently was. A few days later followed the ceremony of which Daenerys Targaryen would be wed to Khal Drogo. Aegon watched with pure intrigue as the Dothraki fought to the death for their entertainment. It's not a true Dothraki wedding. It's not a true Dothraki wedding unless at least 3 people die, Jorah remarked as Viserys looked on with an expression of judgment. Aegon decided to himself that he would ask the winning warrior to teach him how to fight like that once the wedding had ended. Aegon was already beginning to fantasize about defending himself against Robert's assassins when Jorah approached with a small box of which contained what appeared to be 3 dragon eggs. "Are those?" Aegon began with a look of fascination as he had recognized the objects from the illustrations in the books that Viserys would often read to him. "Petrified dragon eggs. A bit of a wedding present for the new Khaleesi," Jorah explained, even though Aegon seemed to take up more of an interest in the eggs than his aunt seemed to. "Will they hatch?" Aegon then asked as he reached for the green egg, feeling an intense connection to its energy. If he had a dragon, nobody would ever try to harm him again. "I'm afraid not. They're fossils. They've been turned to stone," Jorah explained, much to Aegon's disappointment, as the raven-haired man reluctantly placed the egg back into the case. Whilst Daenerys was in the process of being defiled by her new husband, Aegon would remove the green egg from its case once again and place it upon the hot coals within the tent that he was currently sharing with Viserys. "What are you doing?" Viserys demanded with mild irritation, startling Aegon out of his train of thought. "I was just..." Aegon began as he turned to face his uncle, having forgotten completely that he had been sitting upon a stack of pillows behind him. "You heard Mormont. Those things are never going to hatch," Viserys reminded. Aegon let out a sigh, and without thinking, he removed the egg from the coals with his bare hands. "No, you idiot! Don't you know how hot those coals are?" Viserys quickly got up to smack the stone egg from his nephew's hands. He then grabbed Aegon's wrists in order to assess his nephew's injuries, only to find that there were no burns. "You need to be more careful. You are our king, after all." Viserys then scolded in spite of his mild confusion. "Yes, uncle." Aegon timidly agreed with a sigh of defeat. As the weeks went by, Daenerys slowly grew to fall in love with her new husband. Her and Aegon had really begun to embrace the Dothraki culture. Whilst Doria taught Daenerys how to truly pleasure her husband, Aegon learned the Dothraki way of fighting, soon becoming one of the strongest warriors amongst the tribe. Aegon had even taken on a few tribal tattoos and had allowed his new warrior companions to braid his hair. However, Viserys was not adapting to the Dothraki's way of life so easily. The Dothraki warriors would only antagonize Viserys for being so uptight, and in severe cases would even beat him. Daenerys had even lashed out at him, having had enough of his abuse towards her. She had threatened to cut off his hands. Viserys would later get back at her by slipping milk of the poppy into her drink and causing her to miscarry her unborn child with Khal Drogo. How both Daenerys and Khal Drogo would be devastated by the loss, much to Viserys' satisfaction. However, Viserys would soon turn his resentment towards Aegon as the days passed. Had Aegon never been born, they may have never had to go into hiding. There may have never been a war in the first place, and more importantly, Viserys would have been the king. Viserys was convinced that his nephew had ruined his life and had stolen his birthright. Furthermore, Viserys was convinced that Aegon the Sixth must die. One night, whilst Aegon had been attempting to hatch the green dragon egg once again, Viserys would sneak up behind his nephew with the golden egg in hand and would use it to knock his nephew unconscious. Viserys would then take his revenge upon Khal Drogo by poisoning his food with nightshade berries. Sorry. Viserys would later enter the tent just as Daenerys was in the process of sobbing over the cold body of her deceased husband. "What's the matter, my sweet sister?" Viserys would then ask her with a menacing tone before grabbing his sister by the hair and dragging her out of the tent along with the corpse of Khal Drogo. To Daenerys' horror, she saw that Aegon had been tied to the funeral pyre that Viserys had built in advance for the corpse of Khal Drogo. Resting within Aegon's lap had been the 3 stone dragon eggs that Aegon had been so obsessed with. Placing the corpse of Khal Drogo upon the pyre, Viserys then tied his struggling sister to the pyre, as well as Aegon, just as Aegon had begun to awaken. "Stop!" Jorah attempted to rescue Daenerys and Aegon, only for Viserys to shove the frail old man to the ground with ease. The Dothraki soon began to emerge from their tents upon hearing the commotion. "Behold! I, Viserys Targaryen, second of my name, have single-handedly killed your Khal. I am your new king. I am the dragon's son, and I swear to you that all who oppose me will die screaming," Viserys then announced to the crowd of Dothraki with a newfound madness, as the entire tribe began to weep with despair. "You will never hear me scream," Aegon defiantly retorted as he struggled against his bindings. "I will!" Viserys spat before returning his attention to the tribe. "But it is not your screams I want, only your lives." Viserys then coldly announced before using his torch to set the pyre ablaze. Just as Aegon had promised, neither he nor Daenerys would scream, even as they were both engulfed by the flames. Jorah looked on in horror as Viserys grinned with malice at what was left of his family seemingly burned alive. The following morning, nothing more remained of the funeral pyre than a small pile of ash. To everyone's surprise, Aegon and Daenerys sat amongst the ashes. They were both completely naked but unharmed. Both of them glared up at the horrified Viserys. In her hands, Daenerys held a black dragon hatchling and a gold dragon hatchling, whilst a green dragon hatchling began to crawl up Aegon's back, soon perching himself upon his shoulder. "Blood of my blood." Jorah then knelt before Aegon and Daenerys whilst the Dothraki tribe followed suit. The green hatchling stood tall, flapping his small wings as he began to screech in response. "Stop it! Stop kneeling all at once! I have slain your Khal! I am the rightful king!" Viserys demanded, only for 2 Dothraki soldiers to restrain him. Viserys screamed in pain as the soldiers broke both of his arms in the process. "Dracarys." Aegon coldly spat coldly spoke a simple command as he glared at his traitorous uncle with a look of pure hatred. Viserys had once sworn to protect him, and now he had just tried to kill him, just as their common enemies have always tried to do. In response to Aegon's command, the green hatchling released a small puff of smoke. "Danny, please!" Viserys tearfully begged his sister for mercy that would never come. "Dracarys." Daenerys followed Aegon's lead with a high Valyrian command for dragonfire of her own. On command, all three hatchlings began to breathe fire upon Viserys. The silver-haired man wailed in agony as he was burned alive. "He was no dragon," Aegon remarked as he watched the charred corpse of his uncle fall to the ground. "Fire cannot kill a dragon," Daenerys agreed. Chapter 2, House of the Undying. Aegon would grow to favor the green dragon hatchling within the days that had passed, affectionately naming the hatchling Rhaegal, after the fallen father he never knew. Daenerys had become attached to the black dragon hatchling herself, as she decided to name him Drogon after her fallen husband. Both saw fit to name the golden hatchling Viserion in honor of their fallen uncle and brother in honor of who their fallen uncle and brother used to be before his inevitable spout of madness. Okay. As the new Cal, Aegon decided he would fulfill his uncle's promise to him and lead his newfound army on a quest for the Iron Throne. The Dothraki loyally followed their new Cal through the desert, although many, including the horse that Khal Drogo had gifted to Daenerys on their wedding day, would drop dead due to heat exhaustion. Doria's brother was even beheaded by an enemy tribe when he had broken away from the group to hunt. To make matters worse, the 13 of Qarth were refusing to allow Aegon and his tribe to enter the city unless Aegon allowed them to see one of their dragons. Neither Daenerys or Aegon trusted these strangers with their new children, so they obviously refused. "I am Aegon Targaryen, 6 of my name. When our dragons are grown, we are going to lay waste to your armies and burn cities to the ground. Turn us away and your city will be the first." Aegon then threatened once the Spice Master had attempted to turn them away in spite of Jorah's protests. "Ah, you truly are Aegon's ancestor. But you said it yourself. If we don't let you in, your people will die," the Spice Master smirked. Running in fear of a little boy is unbecoming of one of the greatest cities in all of Westeros. Xaro, the wealthiest man in all of Qarth, objected as he stepped forward to challenge the Spice Master. "The boy threatens to burn our city, and you wish to invite him in for a cup of wine?" The Spice Master scoffed. "He is the father of dragons. You cannot expect him to let his people die without breathing fire," Xaro challenged. The Spice Master challenged the Spice Master further. After a brief argument between Xaro and the Spice Master, the 13 reluctantly agreed to allow Aegon's tribe to enter the city. After everyone had been cleaned up and fed, Aegon set out with the company of his aunt as well as his hand in order to attempt to negotiate with the townsfolk. Unfortunately, the party had no luck, as many had turned them away. The only offer Aegon would receive was an offer to trade his aunt's body for one small ship. When Aegon, Daenerys, and Jorah returned to their latest temporary dwelling, they found that it had been ransacked. Half of Aegon's tribe had either been slaughtered or had gone missing. Where are our dragons? Aegon suddenly realized with great despair that his children with Daenerys had been stolen from them. Aegon was soon informed by one of his dying comrades that his dragons had been stolen by a warlock and taken to the House of the Undying. Cal Aegon, Khaleesi, it's too dangerous. This is too dangerous. Let's just leave them, Jorah begged as Aegon began to storm towards the tower with a protective rage. Daenerys timidly following behind him. I'm not abandoning my children, Aegon snapped before entering the tower without even a second thought. Daenerys briefly hesitated with fear before finally deciding to follow her nephew into the darkness of the tower. Cal Aegon! Khaleesi! Jorah shouted after them, only for his cries to fall on deaf ears. Aegon? Daenerys called out into the darkness since her nephew had been walking too quickly for her to keep up. When she opened one of the many doors in search of her nephew, she saw King's Landing before her. Just as Viserys had always described the city in the stories he would read to her and Aegon. Only to Daenerys' horror, the once great city had been burned to the ground, reduced into nothing more than various piles of ash and rubble. Then she saw it, the Iron Throne, just as her brother had always described it. Daenerys stared at the chair made up of swords and all, as ash rained down upon it. She reached out to touch the handle of the throne, only to be startled by the cry of an infant. She instantly felt drawn to the sound as she followed it into a tent, only to find her fallen husband holding the child they had lost. Drogo? But I saw you die, Daenerys pointed out as she stared into the eyes of her deceased husband in a trance of disbelief. Perhaps I refused to enter the Nightlands without you. Khal Drogo smirked as Daenerys approached him with caution. Or perhaps I am dead and have yet to realize it, Daenerys smiled softly in return before taking Rhaego, her beautiful unborn child, into her arms. Baby Rhaego cooed as he smiled up at his mother, Daenerys smiling down at him in return. In the meantime, Aegon followed the sound of his real children screeching, crying out for their parents to rescue them. He followed the screeching all the way to the top of the tower, where he found his poor children chained up like common animals. His dragons all cried out at the sight of him as they attempted in vain to break free of their chains. They miss their father, the warlock spoke up from the darkness, startling Aegon out of his train of thought. They wish to be with you. Do you wish to be with them? Well, you shall be from sunrise until sunset, and then sunrise again, the warlock taunted as he began to circle Aegon with malicious intent before Aegon could even have a moment to realize what had happened. He had been chained to the walls by the warlock. When your dragons were born, our magic was reborn. Our magic is strongest in their presence, and they are strongest in yours. Welcome home, Aegon Targaryen. The warlock smirked as he pulled Aegon's chains tighter. This is not my home. My home is across the narrow seas, where my people are waiting for me. Aegon protested, his voice full of defiance. Well, they are going to be waiting for a long time, the warlock further taunted Aegon. Aegon then turned to look back at his dragons, of whom all three stared up at him with expecting eyes. Dracarys, Aegon instructed as he turned his glare back at the warlock. Rhaegal was the first to respond by coughing up a small puff of smoke. The warlock frowned, sensing that something was amiss. He backed away as Aegon smirked at him. Soon all three dragons lit the warlock ablaze. The warlock screamed in agony as he burned alive. No! Daenerys' screams soon followed when the illusion of her family had disappeared once the warlock had been killed. Aegon frowned in concern at the sound of his aunt's screams as the chains melted away from the bodies of him and his children. When Aegon found Daenerys curled up in a ball sobbing hysterically, his Dothraki rags had been completely burned away from his body, rendering him nude once again. He stared down at Daenerys in concern as he held Drogon and Viserion whilst Rhaegal remained loyally perched upon his shoulder. Later that night, once they had left the House of the Undying, Aegon allowed what remained of his tribe to ransack Qarth. Whilst Jorah attempted to console the traumatized Daenerys, many were slaughtered under Aegon's command. The rest of the 13 included. They saved Xaro for last, finding him in bed with none other than Daenerys' own chambermaid, Doria. With one swift movement, Aegon used the scythe given to him by his Dothraki comrades to snatch the key of Xaro's safe from around his neck. The action awoke Xaro and Doria with a start, as they stared up to find themselves surrounded by an angry tribe of Dothraki soldiers.
"Cal Aegon, please! He said you and Khaleesi would never make it across the narrow seas!"
Doria began in vain to beg for her life, as she and Xaro were restrained by Dothraki soldiers. Empty. Aegon scowled once he had used Xaro's key to open up his safe, only to find it completely empty. "Thank you for teaching me this valuable lesson, Xaro." Aegon then smirked as his comrades forced Xaro and Doria into the safe.
"Aegon, please! Aegon! Cal Aegon!"
Doria begged as Aegon slowly closed the door to the safe.
"I can get you an entire fleet of ships."
Xaro attempted to negotiate, but his and Doria's cries fell on deaf ears as Aegon locked them within the safe to hopefully suffocate to death. Although Xaro's safe had been initially empty, Aegon's tribe had been able to steal enough riches from the houses of the deceased 13 in order for Aegon to buy a fleet of ships himself. Soon Aegon and what remained of his tribe would set sail across the narrow seas towards Meereen. Breaker of Chains. I think this is chapter 3. Yeah. By the time Aegon's ships would arrive to Meereen, the hatchlings had since grown into whelps that were now able to fully hunt and feed themselves with the fish of the ocean. "Your dragons are growing quickly," Jorah remarked as he watched both Rhaegal and Drogon rip a fish to shreds. "Not quickly enough. I need an army," Aegon noted as he stared out at the horizon. He had since adorned himself in red and gold silk, whilst Daenerys had adorned herself in a blue silk dress. The Unsullied are one of the strongest armies in all of Westeros, Jorah informed him. They are an army of slaves," Daenerys protested, since she knew all too well what it felt like to be sold like a common slave. "Do you have any better suggestions, Auntie?" Aegon quipped in a way that reminded Daenerys far too much of her fallen brother. "It's too beautiful of a day to argue." Daenerys sheepishly backed down from the argument. "Besides, I have a plan," Aegon began as a sinister smirk began to stretch its way across his countenance. Once they had reached Meereen, Aegon would be forced to listen to the slave master drone on about how strong his Unsullied armies were. All the while, the slave master would cast insults at Aegon that he thought he would not be able to understand. His interpreter, Missandei, would certainly do her best to leave his insults out of her interpretations. "What did the beggar king and queen wish to trade for my army?" the slave master then asked, what Aegon and Daenerys had to offer for trade. "We have dragons. We'll give you one," Aegon replied with a smirk as Missandei translated his offer to High Valyrian. "He wants the biggest one," Missandei then replied. "Done." Aegon agreed without hesitation once Daenerys and Aegon had retrieved the largest of their 3 dragons. The slave master would lead them to where his unsullied soldiers stood loyally by. "Auntie," Aegon then instructed Daenerys to retrieve Rhaegal from the carrier they kept their dragons in. Rhaegal screeched with protest as he attempted to fly away the moment he had been released, only to be tethered to his mother's hand by the leash she was holding onto. The slave master's jaw dropped at the mere sight of Rhaegal as he immediately handed Aegon his whip in exchange for Daenerys' leash handle. "Is it done then?" Aegon checked as he stared down at the whip. "It is done. You hold the whip," Missandei translated for the slave master. "The Beggar King has his army," the slave master then remarked as he struggled to hold onto Rhaegal's leash. "Unsullied!" Aegon then called out in High Valyrian to his new army, much to Jorah's shock, as he held up the whip. The Unsullied responded by stamping their spears on the ground, as a sign that they understood their new master. "Forward, march!" Aegon then instructed once again in High Valyrian, as his new army began to march towards him. "Halt!" Aegon then commanded with a smirk as his new army came to a halt. "Tell the Beggar King that his beast won't come," the slave master ordered to Missandei as Rhaegal continued to fight against his hold. The dragon is not a slave," Aegon then responded to the slave master in his own language. "You speak High Valyrian?" The slave master then realized with horror that Aegon could understand his insulting banter all along. "I am Aegon Targaryen of Old Valyria. High Valyrian is my father's tongue." Aegon then informed the slave master, causing Missandei to flash a smirk in his general direction. "Unsullied, slay all of the masters. Strike the chains of every slave you see," Aegon then commanded. "But harm no child," Daenerys then added, as the Unsullied began to brutally stab all of the slave masters to death with their spears. "No, stop! I am your master! Kill this crazy bastard! Kill him!" The slave master attempted in vain to regain control over his former army. "Dracarys," Aegon then commanded with a smirk. The slave master proceeded to cry out in pain when Rhaegal had lit him ablaze with his own fiery blast. Soon enough, the ground was littered with the slaughtered bodies of the former masters, as Aegon stood proud amongst the carnage, his favorite child perched upon his shoulder. Jorah stared up at Aegon in disbelief as he approached him with caution. With a smirk, Aegon merely stepped forward, stepping on bodies as he did so. "Unsullied, you have been slaves all of your lives. Today you are free. If any man wishes to leave, he may do so, and no one will harm him. I give you my word." Will you fight for me as free men?" Aegon then requested in High Valyrian. Grey Worm was the first to begin stomping his spear upon the ground, as the other Unsullied soon followed suit. Aegon took one good look at his new army before tossing his whip to the ground as a symbol that all slavery would soon be abolished under his rule. "I still don't feel good about owning an army of slaves," Daenerys spoke up as she followed Aegon on his quest to survey the people. "We're going to treat them fairly. We won't mutilate them or force them to kill babies," Aegon reasoned as he examined how his people lived their daily lives. Daenerys grinned at the sight of a little girl of whom had been holding a ball. The little girl returned the smile before rolling the ball over to Daenerys. Daenerys picked up the ball with a grin and watched as the little girl gestured for her to unscrew it in order to open it. With a giggle, Daenerys was about to open the ball when she was tackled to the ground by a hooded figure. Aegon snatched the stranger off of his aunt with all of the strength he possessed, as Daenerys looked up to find the ball had come open during the struggle. Daenerys watched in horror as a neon green scorpion emerged from the ball and charged at her, only to be stabbed by the dagger of the same man of whom had tackled her. The man then glared at the little girl, of whom at this point had opened her black void of a mouth with a sickening hiss. The man chased after the little girl, but lost her when she had dove into the ocean, disappearing beneath its depths. "What was that thing?" Daenerys fearfully questioned. To no one in particular, whilst clinging to Aegon for comfort. "The warlock, perhaps?" Aegon guessed, although he would never be sure himself. "We owe you our lives," Aegon then said to the stranger, of whom was now facing them. "Who are you?" Daenerys then questioned. "Sir Barristan Selmy," the man introduced himself. "Sir Jorah, do you know this man?" Aegon then inquired upon taking notice of Jorah's discomfort. "Indeed I do. He is one of the most skilled knights in all of Westeros. He is a part of Robert Baratheon's Kingsguard," Jorah explained, provoking Daenerys to hide behind a now hardened Aegon. "King Robert is dead. I have searched all of Westeros for you, my king. Long ago, I promised to protect your family, and I have failed. I have failed you. Forgive me, and I shall never fail you again." Barristan then swore as he knelt before Aegon. Aegon stared down at the man in deep thought before eventually deciding to take him on as part of his own Kingsguard. After all, Aegon did owe Sir Barristan Selmy his life. In the days that followed, Aegon and Daenerys would soon become known as the Breakers of Chains amongst their new people. Aegon would go on to conquer the surrounding cities with ease, with the aid of his new army of Unsullied, and he would free even more slaves. The freed slaves would go on to refer to the two Targaryens as their new mother and father. Lastly, they came across the city of Yunkai. Yunkai will not be an easy city to conquer, Khal Aegon. If they are smart, they will hide behind their stone walls and will slaughter many with their own forces, Jorah explained. "I don't want half of my army to be killed before we reach Westeros," Aegon complained as he heavily began to reconsider taking the city. "There is no reason to take Yunkai, Your Grace," Jorah reinforced. "How many slaves are there in Yunkai?" Daenerys spoke up. At least 200,000 Khaleesi," Jorah responded. "Then there are 200,000 reasons to take the city," Daenerys insisted. Tell the great masters we will receive them here, and if they refuse, we shall show no mercy," Aegon reluctantly instructed Grey Worm. With a sigh of great irritation, Grey Worm nodded before following his king's orders, as the remaining Dothraki went out of their way to set up a tent that would shield Aegon. Daenerys and their growing dragons from the desert sun. With great unease, Razdal, the Lord of Yunkai, would set out along with the company of a small group of his best slaves to meet with Aegon in his tent. "Lord Razdal of Yunkai," You stand before Aegon and Daenerys Targaryen, the Khal and Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea. Mother and father of dragons, breakers of chains. Missandei introduced her king and queen before grabbing a pitcher of cold water. Will the noble lord take refreshment? Aegon mocked with a condescending smirk. Razdal nodded in response, and Missandei poured him a glass of water. Your Grace, Razdal began, only to back away when Rhaegal had hissed at him. You may approach. Sit, Aegon commanded, and Razdal did as he was instructed. Your Grace, you will find no conquest in Yunkai. Razdal began as he watched Aegon pull a raw chicken breast from a small pot. Oh, good. I was told I should bleed my unsullied early. Aegon smirked before tossing the chicken breast into the air. Razdal flinched as his dragons proceeded to rip and burn the small slab of meat to shreds. This was an obvious flex of power on Aegon's end. If bloodshed is what you wish to see, then blood shall flow. However, I have another offer. Razdal began before clapping his hands in order to instruct the slaves to place 2 cases of gold bricks by Aegon's feet. There was more where that came from. For you on your ship, Razdal continued. My ship, Aegon inquired. Yes, an entire fleet of ships. All that I ask in return is that you and your family sail to Westeros, where you belong. Leave Yunkai to conduct our affairs in peace. Razdal offered in an offer that admittedly sounded tempting to Aegon. Nephew, Daenerys then softly spoke before gesturing to the kneeling slaves. I have a gift for you too, Aegon began with a reluctant sigh. As much as he wanted to take Razdal's offer, he loved his aunt dearly and would do anything for her. Your life, Aegon continued, much to Razdal's surprise. What I ask for in return is all your slaves, Aegon demanded. We want you to set them free, Daenerys spoke up once again, much to Aegon's horror. And give them as much food, clothing, and riches as you can carry as payment for their years of service. Daenerys continued with a boldness that only Targaryens possessed. You are mad. Yunkai has powerful friends that will take joy in destroying you. We will all make slaves out of you and any survivors. Perhaps we will make a slave out of you as well. We will make slaves out of any survivors. Perhaps we will make a slave of you as well, Razdal then threatened, which provoked Rhaegal to begin to screech at him furiously. I was promised safe conduct, Razdal reminded with another flinch. Ah, that you were. But my dragons have made their own promises, and you threatened their parents. Aegon smirked up at Rhaegal before stroking his neck to calm him down. Take the gold. Razdal then commanded his slaves approached the cases, only to back away when a hissing and snapping Rhaegal had landed on top of them. My gold, you gave it to me, remember? I shall put it to good use. I suggest you do the same with my gift to you. Now get out. Aegon then darkly commanded as instructed, Razdal stormed out, followed by his small collection of slaves. Yunkai is a proud city. They will not bend easily, Barristan noted. And what happens to things that won't bend? Aegon asked with a smirk. He said he has powerful friends. Who is he talking about? Daenerys then questioned with a look of worry. I don't know, Khaleesi, Jorah admitted with a sigh. Find out. Aegon then instructed before beginning to pack up. Okay, Chapter 4, The Escape. In the days that had passed, Aegon had reopened the fighting pits as a request from the former slaves, in spite of Daenerys' disapproval. His assassins, of whom referred to themselves as the sons... Assassins who referred to themselves as the Sons of the Harpy had begun to murder Aegon's people in cold blood, Barristan Selmy included, and the dragons had grown significantly. As a result of their growth, the dragons had begun to feed upon the livestock of Aegon's people, forcing Aegon and Daenerys to have to compensate them with gold daily. Daenerys began to grow concerned, even though Aegon saw no problem with their children's destructive new behavior. Drogon had even almost attacked Daenerys whilst she was attempting to break up a fight over meat amongst the dragon brothers. Aegon merely brushed off the attacks as their dragons just being wild animals. The final straw for Daenerys was when a man had entered the Great Pyramid in tears. "He came from the sky. It was the winged emerald," Missandei translated for the sobbing man. Describing Rhaegal brokenly, the man then proceeded to present Aegon and Daenerys with the bones of a small child. "Auntie, what do you think you're doing?" Aegon furiously demanded as Daenerys used the carcass of a goat to lure Viserion and Drogon around to the back of the Great Pyramid. "They have gone too far this time, nephew. One of our dragons has killed a child," Daenerys argued as she tossed the carcass inside of the pyramid. Viserion and Drogon immediately chased after the carcass before greedily beginning to fight over it. We are the breaker of chains, and here you are putting our children in chains," Aegon pointed out as Daenerys placed Valyrian steel chains around the necks of Drogon and Viserion whilst they were distracted by their meal. "They are not our children. They are wild animals. You said it yourself." Daenerys finally snapped under the daily pressures of life. "How can you say that?" Aegon demanded in a state of shock as Daenerys began to exit the pyramid. Aegon felt his heart break when Drogon and Viserion began to cry out to them, begging to be released. Because it's true. Because it's the truth," Daenerys retorted before closing the door behind her without a single care for her crying children. Once she had stormed off, Aegon struggled to reopen the door only to fail miserably, since Daenerys had taken the key with her. By nightfall, Aegon was in tears and failing to break down the stone door. With a soft sob, Aegon looked up once the flapping of wings had gained his attention. "Rhaegal?" Aegon grinned upon seeing his green dragon perched upon top of the Great Pyramid. Daenerys had yet to have chained him up, but if Aegon did not get him out of there fast, she would not hesitate to do so. Aegon climbed up to where Rhaegal was perched, and with great difficulty had hoisted himself up onto the Emerald Dragon's back with a small grunt. "So this, Rhaegal! So this!" Aegon commanded Rhaegal to fly in High Valyrian. With a mighty roar, Rhaegal did as he was instructed, using his massive wings to propel himself into the night sky, the ground quaking beneath him as he did so. Daenerys rushed outside once the noise had awoken her, only to find her nephew on the back of the dragon that was now circling the Great Pyramid. "Aegon! Aegon!" Daenerys shouted after her nephew, of whom merely proceeded to ignore her in favor of escaping on the back of his favorite child. Daenerys tearfully watched as her nephew, the only family she had left, had disappeared into the night sky upon Dragonback, as she could not help but mentally question if she'd made a mistake. The next morning, Aegon would awaken beneath Rhaegal's wing. The night before, they had flown away from Marine until they had ended up in a large grass field far from any civilization. They were finally free. Aegon's red and gold silk garments were filthy. His garments had since been ripped into near rags. However, he could not bring himself to care, since he had always secretly hated those clothes, finding them to be scratchy. When Rhaegal had taken flight in search of food to hunt for Aegon soon found himself surrounded by a Dothraki tribe that had long since been an enemy to his own. Having another sinister plan cooked up, Aegon allowed himself to be captured without a fight, allowing the enemy tribe to escort him back to their campgrounds. On the way to the camp, Aegon had been whipped by one of the cows, a slight that cow would later pay for dearly. "State your name," one of the cows demanded in the Dothraki language upon arriving at their camp. "I am Cal Aegon Targaryen, Cal of the Great Grass Sea," Aegon responded in perfect Dothraki before being escorted into the cow's main tent. "You are no cow. You have no voice here unless we say that you do," one of the cows retorted. And what exactly is it that you great cows discuss? Which city you're going to raid next? How many girls you'll get to defile? How many horses you're going to demand? Aegon then began with a great Targaryen bravery to mock the cows, only serving to anger them further. "You are small men. None of you are fit to lead the Dothraki. But I am, so I will." Aegon smirked, since the cows had played right into his devious plan all along. "You crazy white devil! Do you really think we would ever serve you?" The head cow sneered as the other cows all began to laugh at Aegon. "You are not going to serve. You are going to die," Aegon corrected before grabbing a hold of the edge of one of the large torches that had been illuminating the tent. The cows watched with minor confusion when Aegon did not react in pain, even as the flames licked his fingers. Confusion soon turned to horror when Aegon had toppled over the torch, lighting the entire tent ablaze. The last thing the great cows would see before they died was Aegon's sinister grin as the flames resisted him. The Dothraki people watched in mild horror as their leaders were burned alive within their own tent. Many of them sobbed helplessly as the screams of their only leaders they had ever known echoed throughout the tribe. The people would weep until they saw Aegon Targaryen emerge from the flames, completely naked but unharmed. The Dothraki people would all kneel before Aegon at the miracle he had just accomplished, as Rhaegal's roar could be heard approaching in the distance. Alright, chapter... what is this? 2, 3, 4, 5. Chapter 5. Tyrion Targaryen. Tyrion had been raised as a Lannister all his life. However, he had also been treated as lower than dirt by everyone around him, including his own father and his own family, except for his older brother Jaime. However, that would all change the night of the trial, of which he had falsely been accused of poisoning his own nephew. Jaime would help him escape, only to later admit that his former whore, Tisha, had really been in love with him, and that the night they had all taken turns defiling her had been a lie set up by their own father to hurt Tyrion. That night, Tyrion would swear vengeance upon his family, and would even later go on to kill his father, whilst he had been on the toilet of all places. In a fit of rage, he would strangle his former lover, Shae, to death for betraying him during the trial. Tyrion would later go on to escape with Varys, but just as he thought he would finally be free, he would be kidnapped by Jorah Mormont. Jorah planned on offering Tyrion up to Daenerys as a sacrifice in order to obtain forgiveness once she had found out that he was once working for Robert Baratheon and had banished him from her kingdom. However, Tyrion had a plan. He had since found out from one of his books that the Mad King had been allowed to sleep with his mother on her wedding night to Tywin, resulting in his birth. This had been why his father hated him so much, because he had been with the wrong family all along. Tyrion held on to the small shred of hope that he would finally find an accepting family with the Targaryens, as Jorah forcefully exiled him to what he believed would be Tyrion's death. When Tyrion saw Aegon flying above them on the back of the majestic Rhaegal, he took that as a sign that, for once, everything would be okay. Throughout their journey, Tyrion would honestly open up to Jorah about his hopes and dreams. As a result, the two would come to bond, or at the very least, Tyrion wanted Jorah to believe that they were now friends. Perhaps this was why Jorah would take Tyrion down into the crypt of the Great Pyramid to see Viserion and Drogon. "When I was a boy, I had always wanted a dragon," Tyrion admitted as he found himself the most drawn to Viserion. "He didn't have to be a big dragon. He could be little like me." Father laughed at me and informed me that there hadn't been a dragon for thousands of years. But here you are. Tyrion found himself becoming misty-eyed as he reached up without hesitation to free Viserion from his chains. He knew from all the books he had read that chaining up dragons and keeping them indoors would not be good for them, so he planned on freeing both of them. "I'm here to help. Don't eat the help," Tyrion then begged when Drogon had opened up his fiery mouth. At Tyrion's words, Drogon then turned his head in order to allow Tyrion to release him from his chains as well. Tyrion would then do the unthinkable, and would eagerly hoist himself up onto Viserion's back. Viserion did not resist, even as Tyrion carefully gripped onto his spines. Adrenaline began to rush through Tyrion upon realizing that he had successfully claimed Viserion. He then set his wicked gaze upon Jorah as he tightened his grip on Viserion's spines. Tyrion was tired of being treated like a monster, so today he would be the day that he would become one. "Dracarys," Tyrion ordered, having known the High Valyrian command for dragonfire from his books. Jorah merely accepted his fate, allowing Viserion to burn and eat him. It was for the best, since he had contracted grayscale on the way to Meereen. In the meantime, Daenerys had been struggling quite a bit since Aegon had abandoned her. Her own people had turned on her when she had made the mistake of executing a slave for rebelling against his former master. And her own dragons had even completely turned on her. Now, while she had been attempting to enjoy some entertainment from the fighting pits had been ambushed by the Sons of the Harpy. Daenerys reached out to hold Missandei's hand for comfort, now that they found themselves surrounded by highly skilled assassins. Daenerys closed her eyes, preparing for herself for the worst. until she heard the sound of Dothraki war cries in the distance. The fighting pits would soon be flooded with the Dothraki blood riders, of whom would proceed to viciously slaughter the sons of the Harpy. Daenerys was confused until she heard a distant roar approaching.
Aegon!
Daenerys grinned at the sight of Rhaegal landing in the center of the fighting pit with a mighty roar. He had even bitten the head off of an assassin of whom had attempted to attack Daenerys, before lighting many more on fire with his dangerous breath. Upon his back sat Aegon the Free, once again adorned in Dothraki rags, a wolf pelt tied around his neck in order to form a cape. Come on, Aegon commanded as he outstretched his hand in order to help Daenerys onto Rhaegal's back. Daenerys held on to her nephew from behind as Rhaegal took flight, the wind from his wings blowing many people down as he used them to propel himself into the sky. At the sound of Rhaegal's roars, Viserion would use his fiery breath to burst through the wall of the Great Pyramid, with Tyrion still on his back. Tyrion would then hold on for dear life as Viserion took flight after Rhaegal, Drogon following closely behind him. The three dragons would then proceed to circle the ships that were currently in the process of attacking Meereen. Dracarys. Aegon would then command with authority, instructing all three dragons to begin to burn the ships with ease.
Who is this?
Daenerys questioned as she pointed out that Tyrion was still riding upon Viserion's back. I don't know, Aegon admitted as he narrowed his eyes in suspicion once all of the enemy ships had been burned. Aegon landed Rhaegal upon the shore, with Drogon landing next to him. Tyrion then proceeded to land Viserion in front of them, for the first time making eye contact with Aegon. Who are you? Aegon demanded.
I am Tyrion Targaryen. Joanna Lannister was my mother, but Aerys Targaryen was my father.
Daenerys, I am your brother.
Aegon, I am your uncle. We are a family,
Tyrion announced as Viserion roared in agreement. Aegon and Daenerys would go on to stare up at Tyrion in shock. However, due to his proven Targaryen boldness, they would both agree to accept Tyrion as a part of their family. Aegon had even made Tyrion his new Hand of the King. Chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Chapter 6. Field of Fire. Under Tyrion's advising, Aegon and Daenerys decided that it would be best to pursue their journey towards their initial goal of taking the Iron Throne. They would both agree to leave Daario Naharis in charge of Meereen whilst they set sail towards Dragonstone aboard their new ships, Balerion, Meraxes, and Vhagar, all named after Aegon the Conqueror's initial 3 dragons. Upon arriving to Dragonstone, of which had thankfully been uninhabited, Daenerys would wed both Aegon and Tyrion with a blood pact, just as Aegon the Conqueror had done with his 2 sisters. Tyrion then began plans to take Casterly Rock, using his vast knowledge of the underground tunnel system. Tyrion's plans to use the Unsullied to take Casterly Rock would have been successful. However, Cersei had a plan of her own. She had sent her army to successfully take Highgarden, and Euron to successfully capture all 3 of their ships. Missandei had been captured as well, which had particularly upset Aegon. Perhaps I have underestimated our enemies, Tyrion admitted with a grumble as he followed closely behind an enraged Aegon.
Our enemies? Your family, you mean? Perhaps you don't want to hurt them after all, Aegon accused as he whipped around to glare at Tyrion. "They are not my family anymore. You are." Tyrion shouted back at Aegon, much to the raven-haired man's shock. Aegon's words had clearly struck one of Tyrion's nerves as the shorter man looked over to see Viserion land upon the beach behind him. Drawn to his master's distress. "If you want me to prove myself to you, then I will," Tyrion snarled before making his way over to Viserion. "Where are you going? Do not walk away from your king," Aegon demanded. "No more clever plans. I am going to do what I have always wanted to do for quite some time now, that I have the power to do so." Tyrion smirked up at Viserion before hoisting himself up onto the golden dragon's back. "Tyrion!" Aegon shouted after Tyrion as he took flight upon the back of Viserion. "Perhaps you've pushed him too far," Daenerys noted, since she knew how dangerous it could be for a Targaryen to choose violence. "Come on." Aegon sighed in defeat as he briskly approached the landing Rhaegal and Drogon. In the meantime, the Lannister army were marching through a large, dry grass field on their way back to King's Landing, when they had all been startled by the sound of a distant approaching roar. "Spears and shields! Spears and shields!" Jaime frantically shouted his command as Viserion began to swoop in towards the army with another roar. "Dracarys!" Tyrion ordered without hesitation, eager to take his long sought-after revenge upon his traitorous former family. Viserion did as instructed, his fiery breath blowing apart a large chunk of the Lannister army, thanks to the dry grass that surrounded them. The Scorpion is in Cart B," Jaime shouted to Bronn over the screams of his burning army, assuming that it had been Aegon who had just attacked them. "Go get it then." Bronn then instructed Jaime to retrieve the secret weapon they had prepared for Aegon's dragons. "I can't shoot with one hand," Jaime reminded as he held up his bronze prosthetic. Bronn rolled his eyes before riding his horse over to Cart B, as Viserion proceeded to blow apart their army by igniting the dry grass beneath them. Aegon and Daenerys had landed their respective dragons upon a nearby hill. Ow. I need to get a cushion in here. Upon a nearby hill, to watch the carnage unfold. "Should we help him?" Daenerys inquired as she looked to one of her new husbands for guidance. "I think he has it under control," Aegon admitted as he proceeded to watch Tyrion burn the Lannister army alive with the aid of his dragon. Aegon was impressed by Tyrion's brutality, no longer doubting the shorter man standing within his family. "Archers!" Jaime ordered his archers to the front of the lines as Viserion began to swoop in towards them. The archers fired at Viserion, but their arrows merely bounced off of his armor-like scales. "Take cover!" Jaime then warned as he ducked behind a nearby burning cart himself. As Viserion lit his archers ablaze, Jaime finally took notice of the fact that his own little brother had been on the back of the golden beast. Jaime's eyes widened in shock at the psychotic look in Tyrion's eyes as he gleefully reduced his archers into nothing more than scattering ashes with a psychotic laugh. "Tyrion?" Jaime questioned as he watched Viserion disappeared into the smoke-filled sky. "Where are you?" Bronn growled once he had unveiled the giant crossbow that had been dubbed as the Scorpion. His eyes narrowed once he caught sight of Viserion's silhouette, as he fired a shot at the golden beast. The gigantic arrow missed Viserion by a few inches, which Tyrion took as an instant challenge. However, dread began to fill Aegon and Daenerys since one of their children had just been shot at by something massive. Come on. Bronn grumbled as he reloaded the scorpion and took aim at the dragon that was now swooping in towards him. Dracarys! Tyrion shouted as Viserion began to open his fiery jaws. It was then that Bronn fired, managing to hit Viserion in the shoulder. Viserion let out a yelp, much to Tyrion's concern, as he began to fall out of the sky. Bronn laughed victoriously as he began to reload the scorpion. However, Tyrion held on for dear life as his whimpering dragon began to spiral towards the earth. Just as Bronn had managed to reload the scorpion, Viserion had managed to catch himself, as Tyrion now flashed a hateful glare towards his former friend. Bronn then leapt out of the way as Viserion proceeded to burn their own secret weapon. Tyrion! Jaime called out to his younger brother in concern at the psychotic gleam that Tyrion's countenance now held, as Viserion fully landed with another roar. Viserion then proceeded to smack the burning scorpion into splinters with his tail, as Tyrion climbed down from his back. Viserion roared from the pain of Tyrion trying to pull the giant arrow from his shoulder blade. Jaime watched with contemplation as what was left of his army began to close in on Tyrion, his new wounded dragon. However, Jaime then decided to flee alongside Bronn when Aegon and Daenerys swooped in to burn the rest of their army to death. They had some sort of giant crossbow, Tyrion explained as Aegon later examined Viserion's wounded shoulder. The scorpions, Daenerys realized upon remembering one particular story that Viserys had told her, where Rhaenys and Meraxes had been shot out of the sky by one that had been built by Dorne. He will be fine, but we need to be more careful, Aegon explained as he bandaged up Viserion's wounded wing with a bit of gauze. Do you think they have more of them? Daenerys inquired with a voice of concern for their only children. No doubt. We may just need a clever plan, Tyrion lamented. Okay, I think this is chapter 7. The Bells. Because Daenerys would beg Aegon not to attack a city full of innocent people, Aegon would take his army to King's Landing and attempt one final time to make peace with Cersei. Upon arriving at King's Landing, Aegon saw to his horror that the city's walls had been decorated with scorpions. They had also been shot at several times by the Iron Fleet on the way to the great city. Thankfully, none of the shots had landed. Cersei would send forth her hand, Qyburn, I think that's how it's pronounced, whilst Aegon would send forth Tyrion to discuss negotiation terms. Surrender, or Missandei dies here and now. Qyburn listed Cersei's terms, only for Tyrion to storm past him with a newfound Targaryen bravery. You are making a grave mistake. This is not a war you can win, sister. Your reign is over, Tyrion shouted up at his smirking sister, much to Aegon and Daenerys' horror. If you have any last words, say them now. Cersei then proceeded to whisper to a tearful Missandei as Aegon and Daenerys and Grey Worm all protectively stepped forward. Missandei made eye contact with Daenerys, of whom was on the verge of tears herself. At this point, Dracarys! Were Missandei's final words before she was beheaded by the mountain. Grey Worm swiftly turned away, looking as if he were going to be ill, whilst Daenerys cried out in despair. Aegon appeared to be angrier than anyone had ever seen him, as he turned his back on Cersei with a grimace. However, Tyrion smirked up at Cersei, knowing that he had successfully tricked her into causing her own demise, before turning to follow his new family back to their camp. Aegon would wait until midnight to ride Rhaegal above the clouds. Then, just as his ancestor had done, he would ride Rhaegal straight down into the center of the Iron Fleet before destroying all of their ships. Shots were fired, but it was too dark to see Rhaegal, even as he torched all of Euron's ships one by one. Daenerys would then proceed to use Drogon's breath to take out the scorpions that lined the wall. Once Tyrion's strategy had been successfully completed, Tyrion would then proceed to land Viserion within the center of King's Landing, upon one of the buildings. Viserion outstretched his wings before releasing a roar that would scare the townspeople, something that filled Tyrion with a sickening rush. "Ring the bells! Ring the bells!" The people then began to call out to their queen, begging for mercy. To Daenerys and Aegon's relief, the bells began to ring, signaling Cersei's surrender, as her Kingsguard all tossed their swords to the ground at the feet of Aegon's army. However, Tyrion was not satisfied, as he began to seethe with rage. He wanted to take revenge upon his family for how they treated him in the past, so he would. Daenerys and Aegon watched with confusion as Tyrion signaled Viserion to fly towards the Red Keep. The townsfolk began to flee from the golden dragon that was now beginning to swoop in towards them. When Tyrion released a pain-filled cry of utter frustration, Viserion took that as a signal to begin to burn the city, which Grey Worm took as a signal to begin to slaughter Cersei's Kingsguard. The rest of Aegon's army followed Grey Worm's lead and began to ransack the city, as Tyrion burned every square inch of King's Landing. Aegon was at a loss of what to do, not wanting to attack one of his own children, as he helplessly watched Viserion burn every crevice of the city, sparing no one. "No! Get back!" Daenerys screamed at her own army before ordering Drogon to burn them in order to spare whichever innocent people she could. Cersei watched in utter shock as Tyrion had finished burning the entire city in order to prove a point of just how much he hated her. Tyrion then set his sights on her before using Viserion to burn down the Red Keep, the bells included. Once the city had been reduced into nothing more than ash, Tyrion landed Viserion in front of what was left of the Red Keep, before entering the crumbling remains of the building. Tyrion made his way down to the cellar, where he began to dig through the rubble. Regret began to form within the pit of his stomach once he found Cersei and Jaime had been crushed to death during his attack. Tyrion bitterly began to weep in mourning of what could have been if he had just been born a normal human being. In the meantime, Daenerys and Aegon entered what was left of the throne room to find that the Iron Throne was still standing. Daenerys stared up at the throne in awe as she reached out to touch its handle. It looked just as it had in her vision. "When I was a boy, I remember our uncle once told me that the Iron Throne was made up of the 1,000 swords of Aegon the Conqueror's enemies. What do 1,000 swords look like to a little boy who can't count to 20? I pictured a mountain of swords so tall that you could only see the soles of the Conqueror's feet." Aegon began to reminisce as he smiled bitterly at the only object that was left of his home. He placed his hand on Daenerys' shoulders in an attempt to comfort her, only to scowl when Tyrion had finally emerged from the cellar. "Have you been down there? Have you seen little children burned?" Daenerys shouted at Tyrion, much to the shorter man's surprise. "It was necessary," was Tyrion's only response. "Necessary?" Daenerys demanded. "I have tried all my life to make peace with my sister. She conspired to have me killed. How have you treated those who've done the same to you, even when it broke your heart?" Tyrion justified his actions. You murdered innocent people. You've destroyed our home," Daenerys pointed out. "You've gone too far," Aegon added. "Forgive me," Tyrion begged, on the verge of tears once again, not wanting to lose the only family he had left. "I can't." Daenerys refused as Aegon unsheathed his Dothraki scythe. Golden wings then outstretched from behind Tyrion's back before Viserion landed next to him with a protective roar. Aegon placed his weapon back into its sheath, knowing that even though he and Daenerys were immune to fire, they were not immune to dragon teeth. "All of my life, I've had no one. I've had no love. People only respect those of whom they either love or fear," Tyrion began as he climbed up onto Viserion's back. "Let it be fear." Tyrion then gripped onto Viserion's spines as the golden dragon's throat began to fill with orange fire. "I hoped we could be a family, but I now see that there is only one thing you care about," Tyrion continued as Daenerys hid behind a protective Aegon. "Dracarys," Tyrion then instructed as Daenerys and Aegon both flinched. However, Viserion had turned his fiery blast upon the Iron Throne instead, melting it into nothing. "Enjoy your throne," Tyrion spat, tossing his hand to the kingpin at Aegon's feet before signaling Viserion to fly away. Daenerys cried out in despair at the loss of the last remaining piece of her home, as Aegon watched Viserion carry Tyrion to safety. "We'll build another," Aegon reassured as he placed a comforting arm around his aunt and wife. Although he was now on the verge of tears himself, now that he had also lost one of his children to a true tyrant. Chapter 8. Winter is Coming. As Aegon emerged from the ruins of the Red Keep, what remained of the Dothraki chanted in excitement at the mere sight of him, as what remained of the Unsullied began to stamp their spears upon the ground. "Blood of my blood!" Aegon announced in High Valyrian to silence his loyal army. "You have kept all of your promises to me. You have slain my enemies in their iron suits. You have torn down their stone houses. You have given me the 7 kingdoms!" Aegon cheered as Rhaegal roared in agreement. "Unsullied, you have been slaves all of your lives. Today, you are liberators!" Aegon cheered once again as his army all cheered and victoriously along with him. But the battle is not over. From Winterfell to Dorne, from the Iron Islands to the Jade Sea, men, women, and children have all been crushed beneath the wheel. Will you break that wheel with me?" Aegon requested, provoking his army to all applaud in response. "Grey Worm!" Aegon then called out to Grey Worm, of whom had been loyally standing by his side. "You have been my most loyal soldier. You have stood by my side since Slaver's Bay. I name you the King's Master of War!" Aegon announced, provoking the Unsullied to begin stomping their spears at the honor as Grey Worm smiled and nodded. "What are we going to do about the other kingdoms?" Daenerys questioned as she moved to stand next to Aegon. Aegon merely turned to face her with a silent glare in response, his wolf pelt blowing in the ash-filled wind. Surely they aren't going to follow us so easily after what Tyrion did," Daenerys pointed out. "Highgarden and the Iron Islands and Dorne belong to us now that we've lost our allies to the war. We'll simply put our people in charge of those titles. Aegon explained his strategy as he turned his gaze back out at the army. "What about the north?" Daenerys then inquired. "I'll handle the north," Aegon stated before heading back inside of what was left of the Red Keep to compose a letter to Lord Ramsay Bolton of Winterfell and his wife, Lady Arya Stark. The letter stated that Ramsay would be able to keep his titles if he simply bent the knee to Aegon and his queen. However, Aegon would later receive a note stating that the North would not kneel. A threat against his own life, and a threat to violate Daenerys. Aegon was understandably furious as he burned the note. He emerged from the ruins of his new castle in preparation to mount his dragon to torch Winterfell, when he found a young man that had been wheelchair-bound waiting out front for him. "Who the bloody hell are you?" Aegon demanded. "I am Brandon Stark. You see, Winterfell was once my home. It had been taken from me by Ramsay Bolton. My own sister chose to marry him in order to seek revenge upon her enemies. She's no longer the sister I grew up with," Bran explained in a monotone voice. "You have the loyalty of the three-eyed raven, for you are the prince that was promised." Bran then swore loyalty to Aegon. Aegon's face began to grow pale at the words Bran spoke as he recalled the family secret that had been passed down to him from his uncle. The secret of Aegon the Conqueror's dream about the end of all men. "So it's true," Aegon murmured as he felt his knees grow weak. "Yes, you can take back Winterfell from me with ease, but that can wait. If you don't stop the Night King now, you'll be ruling over a graveyard," Bran further explained. "The Night King?" Aegon further questioned. Bran then proceeded to tell Aegon all about the Night King, as well as the White Walkers, before telling Aegon where he could find them. "Be careful not to underestimate the Night King," Bran then warned before Aegon rushed to explain the situation to Daenerys. Aegon and Daenerys would then mount their dragons before flying beyond the wall to find the army of the dead, just where the three-eyed raven said they would be. Daenerys and Aegon would use their dragons to begin torching the army of the undead. However, they had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the Night King. The Night King picked up his icy spear and took aim at Drogon. Drogon let out a yelp when the spear had pierced him in the side of his neck. Aegon watched with horror as Drogon crashed into the ice, landing on top of Daenerys and crushing her to death in the process. In spite of his state of shock, Aegon decided to flee just as the Night King had flung one of his icy spears at him. Before he fully fled, Aegon took one last look at his beautiful wife, where his beautiful wife had died beneath one of his children, only to see Drogon slowly sinking beneath the ice. By the time Aegon had returned to King's Landing, he was an emotional wreck as he tearfully announced Daenerys and Drogon's death to his army. The Night King has turned... No, wrong voice. The Night King has turned your dragon into a White Walker. He has used him to melt the wall. He's coming with his army. We have to be prepared. Bran then explained as Grey Worm attempted to comfort Aegon. Aegon knew that his army was too small to fight the Night King's massive undead army, especially now that he only had one dragon. He knew he would need to convince the North to fight with him, so he led his army to Winterfell in the hopes of forming a truce with Ramsay and Arya. Both Ramsay and Arya appeared shocked to see Aegon land Rhaegal in front of their castle. Regardless of their fear of the massive beast, Ramsay remained aloof as Arya stood by him in a protective manner, resembling more of a bodyguard than a wife. So you expect me to form a truce with you based off of a dream one of your dead ancestors had about an undead army? Ramsay questioned with disbelief. Once Aegon explained the situation to him. The army of the undead is real. I have seen it for myself. My wife and son are dead because of the Night King. If it were not true, don't you think I would have burned your city to the ground by now? Aegon pointed out on the verge of tears, once again upon mentioning his fallen wife and son. They were foolish enough to burn down their own city, Arya pointed out, provoking Ramsay to glare at her since he hated when she was right. Alright, Aegon. I'll help you fight against your little undead army, but I want something in return. Ramsay began to negotiate. Of course. Aegon breathed a sigh of irritation. I want the truce to last. I want the North to remain as an independent kingdom. Ramsay listed his terms. I give you my word that no harm will come to you. Aegon begrudgingly agreed. What good is the word of a usurper? It is not your word I want, Ramsay began before setting his sights upon Bran. I no longer have need for such titles. The North is yours, Lord Bolton. Bran agreed with little to no emotion. However, in spite of their agreement, Ramsay and Arya would flee Winterfell in the middle of the night whilst Aegon was asleep, taking their massive army with them. Aegon was naturally furious to find out about the Boltons' betrayal the next morning, vowing to seek vengeance upon them if he survived the upcoming war. Final chapter, The Long Night. After Bran would go on to tell Aegon about the White Walker's weakness, Aegon would order for many weapons to be forged for his army out of dragon glass and Valyrian steel. Aegon would then order the construction of a small fence around Winterfell that would be made up of wooden stakes, to which the Red Witch Melisandre would then light on fire using a magical chant. By night, the army of the undead would arrive, and the Dothraki would be the first to attack with their flaming swords. However, the flames would soon disappear into the darkness as the undead were quick to completely wipe out the Dothraki army. The White Walkers would then proceed to ravage the Unsullied, of whom were able to hold their ground in spite of dwindling quickly. Aegon would then mount Rhaegal and use him to burn a vast majority of the White Walkers, whilst until he was attacked by an undead Drogon. Drogon was now a sickly shade of blue, as was the fire he shot at Aegon and Rhaegal as he chased them through the fog. His roars now sounded ghostly as the Night King rode upon his back. Rhaegal would manage to latch onto Drogon's throat, ripping off half of his face. Ripping half of his face from his skull in the process, as Drogon used his back legs to violently claw Rhaegal's chest. Aegon would make eye contact with the Night King's dead stare as Drogon began to snap at him, ripping his wolf pelt in the process. Drogon was then snatched away from Rhaegal by Viserion once he had laced his teeth into the back of Drogon's neck. The Night King was thrown from Drogon's back during the attack. Aegon was also thrown from Rhaegal's back once the green dragon had crashed into the snow from his injuries. However, Aegon was quick to pick himself back up in order to fight off the White Walkers that were now approaching his injured dragon. What remained of the Unsullied were then rescued from the attacking White Walkers by another army of wildlings, of whom were led by Tisha. Upon Viserion's back sat Tyrion, as he glared down at the Night King with a protective hatred. Dracarys, Tyrion ordered as Viserion breathed fire down upon the Night King, but to Tyrion's horror he would not burn. Tyrion then fled from the smirking Night King as one of his spears just barely missed Viserion. As Aegon continued to fight off the White Walkers, he was then distracted by a twisted, mangled, undead Daenerys slowly approaching him. Traumatized by the sight, Aegon fully broke down, but Rhaegal would soon rip the undead Daenerys to shreds with his teeth in order to protect his rider. Drogon would then rise high above Aegon with blue fire pouring from his neck until he was once again attacked by Viserion. "Go!" Tyrion shouted to Aegon as he pointed to the Night King with the hand that was not currently holding on to Viserion. Aegon did as instructed, approaching the Night King with his dagger raised and a war cry. The Night King would catch Aegon by the throat, but Aegon would still manage to stab the Night King with his through his icy cold heart with his dagger after a brief struggle. The Night King would shatter like glass, as would his army. Drogon would release one final ghostly roar before crumbling into nothing beneath Viserion. By sunrise, the war had ended, and a funeral was held for those of whom had fallen during the war. "You came back for me. Why?" Aegon questioned Tyrion at the funeral. "Because you're the only family I have left," Tyrion replied on the verge of tears. Aegon would respond by kneeling down to pull his uncle into a tight hug. And slowly, Tyrion would hug his nephew in return. Aegon began once he had stood back up, only to become emotional once again at everyone he had lost. Tyrion looked to the tearful Aegon with concern before deciding to take over for him. "Dracarys," Tyrion shouted with authority, as Rhaegal and Viserion responded by burning the funeral pyre. Rhaegal released a whimper of concern as Aegon turned away, refusing to watch the bodies burn. Whilst Tyrion had been away with Viserion, he had not only managed to reunite with Tisha, but he had also collected various petrified dragon eggs from the Shadowlands. Aegon and Tyrion would then proceed to hide the stone eggs around Winterfell. They would wait for Ramsay and Arya to return to Winterfell with their army before using their dragons to burn Winterfell to the ground. Many new dragon hatchlings were born from the various blood sacrifices of Winterfell's people. After a few years had passed, Tyrion would go on to marry Tisha and have 3 children with her, of whom he would name Jaime, Cersei, and Tywin, after the family he had always wanted. Aegon would fall in love with a red-headed wildling girl by the name of Ygritte. And would go on to have 3 children with her as well, of whom he would name Dany, Missandei, and Barristan, after his fallen loved ones. King Aegon would then take Tyrion back as his hand of the king. They would rebuild King's Landing and would rebuild the Iron Throne from the melted swords of their fallen enemies, and they would finally succeed in breaking the wheel in order to ensure that the wheel stayed broken. Aegon and Tyrion would be sure to instill their values upon their children. Their children would do the same for their grandchildren, and so on. They would once again only marry within the family,
in order to keep the bloodline pure, just as Viserys had taught Aegon to do long ago. The Targaryen family would reign once again, and the dragons would once again fill the skies. The realm would finally remain at peace once and for all, now that Aegon the Free, father of dragons, breaker of chains, the prince that was promised, had successfully abolished slavery. Especially now that he had defeated the Night King and saved all of mankind. The end.